From the American Experience Storybook, Robert E. Lee, 1807 to 1870. I have fought against the people of the North because I believed that they were seeking to wrest from the South its dearest rights, but I have never cherished toward them bitter or vindictive feelings, and I have never seen the day when I did not pray for them. As quoted by Charles Sherwood Ferris in The American Soul, an appreciation of the four greatest Americans and their lessons for present Americans. Robert E. Lee's father, Light Horse Harry Lee, had been a cavalry leader in the Revolutionary War, so it was no surprise when Robert enrolled in West Point Military Academy. He graduated with no demerits, perfect scores in artillery, infantry, and cavalry, and a reputation as a strong and honorable man. Robert's military success continued, particularly in the Mexican-American War and the slave revolt at Harper's Ferry. As the Civil War brewed, President Abraham Lincoln heard of Robert's military brilliance and good character and offered him command of the Union Army. While Robert believed in the Union and did not want to fight for slavery, he felt a duty to his home state. He resigned from the United States military and agreed to lead the Confederate Army. Robert's leadership style and decisions were daring and unconventional to the point of shocking his opponents, which often gave him the upper hand. In the battle at Chancellorsville, Robert faced an army much bigger than his own, yet he instructed his forces to divide into three even smaller groups before attacking. Union commander Joseph Hooker had no idea how to react, and Robert led his men to victory. Still, eventually, the Union Army began to win the war, and in 1865, Robert surrendered to General Ulysses Grant in Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Though Robert could have been hanged as a traitor, President Lincoln and General Grant honored his character by allowing him to return to his private life. Robert later became president of Washington College, which was renamed Washington and Lee after Robert passed away. The following excerpt is from True Stories of Great Americans for Young Americans by Elbridge Streeter Brooks and Thomas Shepard Meek. Chapter: The Stirring Story of Robert E. Lee, General of the Confederate Armies. This is to tell you the story of Robert E. Lee. Every boy and girl in America knows who he was, a great American soldier. But he was more than a great soldier. He was a hero, and this is a hero story. Is there any boy or girl who does not like to hear about a hero? You know what a hero is, don't you? It is one who does great deeds in a grand way. Ever since the world began, there have been heroes. Some have been soldiers, some have been kings, some have been plain, poor men or boys. But the world has liked to hear their stories, from David, the boy who killed Goliath the giant, to George Washington, who delivered his land from tyranny. In this dear America, which is our native land, we have had many heroes. They have defended us in danger, fought for us in war, cared for us in peace, and every boy and girl in America is told the story of their lives and taught to love and respect and honor them. It is the story of one of these brave and heroic men that I wish now to tell you. The story of Robert E. Lee, who fought long and bravely for what he believed to be the rights and liberty of his fellow men in the southern half of the United States of America. Listen to his story. Many years ago, when your grandfather's grandfather was helping make the 4th of July, a certain brave and gallant soldier fought in almost all the battles of the American Revolution. People called him Light Horse Harry Lee. This was because he was the leader of a number of dashing, fast-riding soldiers or cavalry called Light Horse, because the riders were dressed and armed as lightly as possible. In this dress, they could ride swiftly and act quickly. Light Horse Harry Lee was a splendid horseback rider, and his swift and daring dashes with his Light Horse Legion did a great deal toward whipping the British and making the American Revolution a success. General Washington thought very much of this brave Virginia horseman, and when the war was over, wrote him a letter in which he sent him his love and thanks for what he had done in the American Revolution. And when the great and good Washington died at his beautiful home in Mount Vernon, it was his friend, the dashing cavalry soldier, who spoke those splendid words about the greatest American. Words which, I hope, you all know by heart. Washington, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Nearly 25 years after the American Revolution ended in success, when Light Horse Harry Lee had been Governor Lee of Virginia and was writing a book about the American Revolution, a little baby boy was born into his pleasant Virginia home. This baby was named Robert Edward Lee, and he was to grow up to become an even greater and nobler man than his famous father. Robert E. Lee was born on the 19th of January, 1807. The very year in which our great American poets Longfellow and Whittier were born. His father's house was at a beautiful country place in Virginia called Stafford. It was in Westmoreland County on the Potomac River, the very county in Virginia in which George Washington was born, and on the banks of the same Potomac River. He was a good boy in everything, good in his home, good in his school, good in his looks, and good in his ways. His father was not very well when Robert was a little boy and had to be away from home a great deal, hunting for good health. So Robert's mother brought her boy up. She brought him up well and made a man of him because she made him true and manly from the start. He was never what little boys called a sissy just because he was mild and good, but was a manly, brave, true-hearted little fellow, kind to all about him, always in love with his mother, always obeying her, attentive to his studies, doing his duty in every way as a real boy should. When Robert was 4 years old, his father moved from his country home at Stafford to the little city of Alexandria, quite near to Washington, the capital of the nation. There, Robert went to school in a queer old-fashioned yellow house that is still standing in Alexandria and is still used for a boys' school. Its right name was Hollowell's School, from the master who kept it, but the boys who went there called it, because of its yellow walls, Brimstone Castle. Brimstone is another name for sulfur, a yellow element that smells like rotten eggs. When Robert was 11 years old, his father, the famous Light Horse Harry Lee of the American Revolution, died in Georgia, where he had gone for his health. The fatherless boy clung closer to his mother than ever and determined to do everything he could to help her. But he had such a great respect for his father's memory and felt so much pride in the deeds his famous father had done in the cause of liberty and his native land, that when the time came for him to decide what he would do when he became a man, he declared he would be a soldier, just as his father had been. So he went to West Point, the famous military academy on the bank of the Hudson River, where the United States trains boys to lead its armies and fight its battles. Robert E. Lee stayed 4 years at West Point. He entered there as a plebe, or new boy, in 1825 when he was 18 years old, and leaving it, or graduating as it is called, as Lieutenant Lee in 1829. He did finely at that famous school. He was what they called a model cadet, always spick and span in his gray and white soldier suit, always at the head of his studies, always ready in his duties, in his drills, and in all he had to do. He never received a demerit or a bad mark in all the 4 years he was a cadet at West Point. Think of that. They said there that Cadet Lee kept his gun so bright and clean that the inspecting officer could fairly see his face in the gleaming barrel and its polished stock. He was such a fine scholar at West Point that when he got through and graduated, he stood second in his class. That is, next to head, you know. This gave him a chance to choose just where he would like to be in the Army when he came out of West Point. He joined what is called the Engineer Corps, the pick of the whole Army. The Engineer Corps is made up of men who look after building the forts and defenses of our harbors, set our river channels straight, and protect the land from sea as well as from the enemy. It is a fine position for a young officer and generally gives him pleasant places to live in and agreeable things to do. Soldiers like it better than being sent off to lonely posts or to watching Indians, and it gives them a fine training in how to do things about forts and fighting. Lieutenant Lee was stationed in different places along the Atlantic coast. He helped plan and build Fortress Monroe on the beautiful Hampton Roads in Virginia. He was stationed in Washington in one of the offices of the big War Department. He helped lay out the boundary lines between the states of Ohio and Michigan. He looked after the improvement of the harbor of St. Louis and the changes that were made in the shifting channels of the mighty Mississippi River. He superintended the building of the new forts in New York Harbor, and when he got back from a war, which I will soon tell you about, he was made superintendent of the very place he had gone to school, the military academy at West Point. After that, he had command of all the United States troops in Texas. He was second lieutenant in 1829, then first lieutenant, then in 1838, captain in the regular army. So you see, he kept going right on in the world and was a great deal thought of in the army. The United States did not have a very big army in those days, but whenever there was a war, it grew quickly. In the year 1846, there came about a war between the United States and its next-door neighbor, the Republic of Mexico. Never mind what it was all about. You will learn that when you study the history of the United States. It was a cruel war, as all war is cruel, but it was a great chance for Americans who wished to be real soldiers to show what they were good for and what they could do. They did well. They marched into Mexico, which is just the other side of Texas, and they fought so bravely that in less than 2 years, they had conquered Mexico and added to the United States all the land from Texas to California and the Pacific Ocean. In this war, Robert E. Lee made a splendid soldier. He was so brave and gallant, so ready and reliable, and he was always to be found where the fighting was fiercest. And yet he was so gentle and kind that he always struck at the point in the enemy's line where they could be beaten the quickest, so as to finish the fight with the smallest loss of men, and killed and wounded. There was one battle in Mexico in which the young engineer was almost the leader and conqueror. This was the time when he got the best of the Mexicans at a place called Cerro Gordo, high up in the mountains. The Mexican soldiers held the zigzag road up the mountains. It ran between great cliffs and chasms and had cannons all along so as to keep the Americans from coming up. But Captain Lee, the engineer, said, "If we can't march against them, we must get behind them. I'll try." He hunted all about for a good place and at last saw a way by which a sort of path could be cut through the mountains and come out behind the Mexicans. He did this so carefully, so swiftly, and so silently that before the Mexicans knew what they were about, he was right upon them. Captain Lee led the way and showed the men just what to do. They lowered the cannons by ropes down the steep cliff and hauled them up on the opposite hillside. They cut and climbed and jumped and dug until they got all the men, all the horses, and all the cannons up behind the Mexican line. Then they turned their guns upon the enemy and so surprised and terrified them that almost without a blow, all that part of the Mexican army surrendered to the American commander, General Scott. This was one of Captain Lee's victories in Mexico. It was one of the kind he liked because he had to think it out. It was the best kind of victory, too, for he won it without having to shoot down and kill very many men. For his courage and his soldiership, he was again and again promoted. Captain, Major, Lieutenant Colonel, Colonel. He was on the staff of the commander, Winfield Scott, the general of the American Army, and after the Mexican War was over, General Scott declared that his success in Mexico was largely due to the skill, valor, and undaunted courage of Robert E. Lee. That is a good deal to say about one man, is it not? And fine, too. After the Mexican War was over and all the soldiers had come home, Colonel Lee was made superintendent of the military academy at West Point, as I've already told you. For 3 years he was in charge there, directing the soldier boys in their studies and their drilling at their splendid military school on the banks of the Hudson. Then he was sent to join the army stationed in Texas. He was a colonel of a cavalry regiment, the same position that his famous father, Light Horse Harry, had held in the Army of the Republic. Later on, he was placed in command of all the soldiers in what was called the Department of Texas. While he was home on a long vacation at his beautiful home in Virginia called Arlington, just opposite Washington, the Civil War broke out. You know what that was, of course. The dreadful and terrible trouble between two parts of our dear native land, the North and the South. It could not be settled peaceably. Men thought so differently about things that one side would not give in to the other, and so they just had to fight it out. It was a long and bitter war. Many good and brave men were killed on both sides. There was sorrow and distress all over the land. But when the war was over, the people of the United States became better friends than they had ever been before, and there will never be such a war again. When the war broke out, Colonel Robert E. Lee did not know just what to do, but he thought the matter over long and deeply. Then he said, "I cannot fight against my relatives, my children, my home. I have been a soldier of the United States, but I am a son of Virginia, and I must do as my state does." He resigned from the United States Army, giving up his position of colonel, and was made Major General of the forces of the state of Virginia. When Virginia went out of the Union, that is, when her people said, "We will not belong to the United States any longer. We will join the Confederate States," Colonel Lee said, "Then I must go with you." He was appointed military advisor to Jefferson Davis, the president of the newly formed Confederate States, for so the states that went out of the Union called themselves. A year later, he was made commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, and for 3 years he led the brave Southern soldiers who fought for the Confederacy against the brave Northern soldiers who fought for the Union. What a splendid leader of those gallant Southern soldiers General Lee was. He knew just where to have them march, just when to have them fight, just what to have them do. And I think we'll pause here and we'll finish this story in the next video. Thanks so much for listening. And remember, I love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.